afternoon, everybody. My name is Matt Clark. For those of you who don't know me, I've been Isaac's thesis mentor, and this has been a good one. Done a lot of these. This has been a really good one. So let me do my best to introduce him here. About 1,800 years ago, Tertullian asked, "What hath Athens to do with Jerusalem?" A lot, it turns out. The dynamic between classical pagan wisdom and Christian revelation has been profoundly fruitful. I'm often asked about classical Christian education and what we're trying to accomplish with it for our students. My response is always the same. We are trying to make your sons into good men and your daughters into good women. Unlike the vast majority of policymakers and think tank denizens, Isaac is applying his classical education to very modern problems in that he is trying to determine how to live a good life in the face of medical and scientific advancements. I've worked with him over the past few months, and I've been glad indeed to see how he's wrestled with the implications for human flourishing that advancements in the genetic sciences present. He's worked very hard to bring both Athens and Jerusalem to bear on the medical problems present in modern America. So please join me as in a prayer for Isaac. O Lord, our Heavenly Father, who has fashioned and knit us together after your own design, who has given us limitations that you might be glorified in our weaknesses, we ask now that you would use your servant Isaac to bring to light those things about our bodies which we may contemplate and act upon for our physical health and our spiritual benefit. Through Jesus Christ our Lord, who liveth and reigneth with thee in the Holy Spirit, one God, world without end. Amen. And Isaac.
In 1818, Mary Shelley imagined a scientist who dared to rewrite the laws of nature. In Frankenstein, Victor steals the secrets of creation and stitches together a new being driven by an unsatiating ambition. He never stops to ask whether he should, he only proves that he can. 2 centuries later, this story was no longer a fantasy dreamed up by some 19th century novelists. In 2018, a scientist named He Jiankui announced that he had edited the DNA of 2 unborn children to prevent the transmission of HIV, altering their genetic code before they ever took their first breath. Today we stand before a new Prometheus, not the thief of fire, but of the genetic code. The question concerning genetic engineering is no longer whether we possess the wisdom to whether it will be a feasible tool, but whether we possess the wisdom to wield its flame. CRISPR is a DNA sequence that was first discovered in the genome of E. coli bacteria in 1987. Roughly 3 decades later, advances had now combined CRISPR with a protein called Cas9 that acts as a molecular tool like scissors that cuts DNA at precise locations. It was also combined with an RNA guide sequence that served as a GPS system for CRISPR. This combination of tools transformed CRISPR from a simple DNA sequence into one of the most precise and accessible gene editing tools in history. Emmanuel Charpentier and Jennifer Doudna received the Nobel Prize in Chemistry back in 2020 for the discovery of fundamental CRISPR-Cas9 capabilities. In the midst of these discoveries, a scientist from Shenzhen, China, made a striking announcement in November 2018. He Jiankui announced his results to his experiments to genetically engineer 2 newborn babies to prevent the transmission of HIV. This was the first recorded and publicly acknowledged case of human germline editing. This sparked public outrage not only from China, but from the rest of the world. Some argued that Jiankui's motives were noble and should be praised, while others declared it an atrocity. Moreover, this fueled a debate on the ethical usage of genetic engineering and forms the basis of discussion for my thesis. This genetic scandal changed the question of CRISPR from can we edit embryos to should we. There are 2 specific forms of genetic engineering: somatic edits that affect only one person, and germline edits that get inherited by their children. Somatic therapies have been researched and regulated for 20 years, whereas germline therapies are more risky given their relative novelty and lack of sufficient human testing. Germline editing specifically is a variant that many are concerned with when considering the ethics of genetic engineering. This is due to the danger of inheritable permanence that comes with editing the embryo. Other concerns involve unpredictable mutations as well as a lack of regulation. However, it is also necessary to acknowledge CRISPR's vast potential. Many genetic disorders that currently lack cures may be treatable or even preventable in the near future. The prospect of eliminating dangerous or chronic diseases is very promising, not only medically, but also socially and economically. How, nevertheless, CRISPR's potential benefits must be weighed against the ethical stakes involved. Considering the wide range of this topic, determining whether or not political structures should regulate genetic engineering falls beyond the scope of my thesis. While political action may be an extension of my thesis, the primary aim today is to evaluate the ethical, not legal, permissibility of genetic engineering, specifically within the context of germline therapies. As CRISPR acts as a double-edged sword, both with vast benefits and immense risks, germline genetic therapies should not be fully eradicated nor fully liberated. Instead, its applications must be guided by firm boundaries that permit therapeutic uses for treating or preventing disease while banning enhancement-driven modifications. First, I will establish a definition of human flourishing through Plato and Aristotle's frameworks. Then this definition will be applied to therapeutic treatments to show how it fosters human flourishing, and also to enhancement treatments to show how it degrades flourishing. We must first determine what constitutes human flourishing through Plato's conception of flourishing eudaimonia, specifically within the soul and society as a whole, as well as Aristotle's form of flourishing and the highest good. In the Republic, Plato seeks to divide the soul up into three main parts: reason, spirit, and appetite. He discusses the first two parts of the soul as governing attributes that seek to oversee the appetites of the soul, which are, quote, the largest parts of each person's soul and is by nature most insatiable for money. Furthermore, Plato specifically cautions against the appetites because of its disposition to disrupt the harmony of the soul. Concerning this harmony, Plato emphasizes that in all affairs, whether political, transactional, or relational, a just human being or a just society as a whole will believe that whatever is just will preserve harmony, the inner harmony of the soul, and help achieve it. Hence, according to Plato, human flourishing constitutes a harmony of the soul with reason governing the appetites. Yet harmony of the soul, or internal flourishing alone, isn't sufficient to account for how human flourishing unfolds within a human being or within a community. Aristotle explains that human good or flourishing, quote, turns out to be an activity of the soul in accordance with virtue. Flourishing is therefore not a static state, but a lifelong practice of virtue and reason. Even though Aristotle acknowledges the necessity of certain external goods, he insists that happiness is fundamentally independent of such goods. Hence, Aristotle presents that human flourishing is a life dedicated to virtue and prudence. In sum, human flourishing can be understood as a hierarchical harmony of the soul, life, and virtue. From Plato, it requires the internal ordering of reason over appetites to maintain justice and balance within the soul. From Aristotle, it demands that flourishing unfolds through the lifelong practice of virtue, guided by reason and oriented towards self-sufficient happiness. Together, these frameworks suggest that human flourishing is not merely pleasure or success, but the integral cultivation of virtue, reason, and harmony across the individual and communal life. Enhancing genetic therapies subordinate rational deliberation to appetitive desires, which directly violates Plato's conception of the flourishing soul. To understand this issue's nuance, it is worth first acknowledging a basic tendency of human nature, that people possess an innate disposition to alter their appearances and abilities in response to societal pressure. Whether through clothes, makeup, cosmetic surgery, or body modifications, Plato would recognize this tendency immediately as the work of man's appetites. Solomon Asch conformity experiments demonstrated that approximately 75% of participants conformed at least once to an obviously incorrect majority judgment. Applied to genetic enhancement, it follows that parents confronted with societal ideals of beauty, intelligence, or athletic ability will face enormous pressure to engineer those traits into their offspring. A decision driven not by rational deliberation, but by appetites responding to social conformity. Plato's Republic is clear on this. A just and flourishing soul is one in which reason governs and the appetites are firmly subordinate to its authority. A society where genetic enhancements become dominant inverts this hierarchy, disrupting the flourishing of the soul. Genetic enhancements would begin a tyranny of social appetitive control, which would be passed on through generations engraved deep within our genetic code. Furthermore, this corruption of the soul isn't mere individual corruption, but mirrors the corruption of society as a whole. Plato warns in his Republic that the degeneration of the soul mirrors the degeneration of the city. A polis that permits germline enhancements encourages the dominion of appetite over reason, building its foundation on appeasing its appetites. Enhancing genetic therapies also violate Aristotle's notion of flourishing by avoiding the practice of virtue and circumventing the process by which human flourishing is achieved. For example, let us consider the formation of temperance in the souls of a 4-year-old boy. From a very early age, appetites run rampant as tantrums, whining, and hyperactivity become very normal occurrences for toddlers. As such, it may be observed that temperance is very limited for a 4-year-old boy. Yet within several years of discipline and proper parenting, the child typically develops maturity and self-control. However, let us assume that a new genetic therapy was developed to target MAOA, also known as the warrior gene responsible for child aggression, and suppress its functions. These genetic enhancements would be able to skip the processes of training, teaching, counseling, and practicing the skill of self-control by completely suppressing the gene for aggression. In effect, the child would arrive in a behavioral state that resembles temperance without having undergone the developments that are necessary to maintain temperance as a genuine virtue. This distinction is critical to Aristotle's frameworks. In Aristotle's Ethics, he argues that virtue is a hexis, which entails a settled state of character that is achieved through consistent habits and perfected through the exercise of practical wisdom. As such, virtue is not just a pattern of behavior or emotional tendency, but a fundamental state of excellence that is achieved through continued practice of virtue, undertaken with reason and chosen for its own sake. Moreover, Aristotle's doctrine of the mean reveals an additional dimension to this problem. According to Aristotle, virtue lies within a mean between certain extremes, determined not by a mathematical midpoint, but by what is appropriate to the particular circumstances or situations and the particular person. As such, in our case, temperance is the mean between self-indulgence and insensibility. Crucially, identifying this mean requires Aristotle's phronesis, which is itself a virtue that can only be cultivated through experience, reflection, and the exercise of judgment in concrete situations. Someone who possesses practical wisdom knows not only that one should be temperate, but exactly when, how much, toward whom, and for what purpose. This fundamental judgment cannot be genetically encoded. Genetic enhancements might produce a uniform dampening of impulsive responses and reactions, but they cannot teach a child when restraint is called for and when immediate action is required, when patience is a virtue and when it becomes slothful passivity. The enhanced child would possess a rigid behavioral tendency of patience, whereas Aristotle calls for a life of virtue that demands a flexible, adaptive excellence in life. Contrary to enhancement-driven therapies, genetic treatments used to cure and prevent diseases promote human flourishing and should be researched further and embraced because of their ability to restore conditions necessary for flourishing. Unlike aesthetic or enhancing interventions, therapeutic applications of germline editing do not subordinate reason to appetite or circumvent virtue formation. Rather, they remove the impediments to the very conditions that make human flourishing possible in the first place. Plato's conception of human flourishing is grounded in the harmonious ordering of the soul, with reason governing appetite. However, this harmony assumes a fundamental capacity for engagement with the world. Take Huntington's disease, which I will refer to as HD, as an example. The Huntington's Disease Society of America says that 41,000 people in America have HD, with estimates reaching to 135,000 people globally. In individuals with HD, an abnormal expansion of CAG repeats within the HTT gene results in the production of a defective Huntington protein. Over time, this abnormal protein accumulates in neurons responsible for movement, cognition, and emotional regulation, leading to progressive degeneration, neurodegeneration. As the disease advances, individuals experience impaired judgment, memory loss, personality changes, and eventually the loss of the capability for independent reasoning. Furthermore, HD is irreversible and ultimately fatal, typically within 15 to 20 years of symptom onset. However, it is critical to acknowledge that HD does not strip a person of inherent dignity, nor does it render every instance of human flourishing impossible. Nevertheless, it progressively degrades the rational capacities required for deliberation and self-governance. A disease that steadily erodes memory judgment and impulse control puts a burden on the very means by which Plato's harmony is achieved. If reason is the governing element of the soul, then a condition that biologically degrades rational capacity undermines the stability necessary for such hierarchy within a soul to endure. Therefore, germline genetic interventions that seek to prevent the transmission of HD do not enhance natural order or impose aesthetic preferences. Rather, they preserve or restore fundamental rational integrity that is necessary for flourishing. In some, therapeutic interventions do not manufacture virtue artificially. Rather, they preserve the rational biological conditions under which virtue may be cultivated, that is, through reason and habituation. Although the case for rejecting enhancing genetic therapies and embracing therapeutic genetic therapies may be clear, the dividing line distinguishing between genuine enhancing and therapeutic treatments is not as clearly as defined. Some argue that the distinctions between enhancing and therapeutic treatments are often arbitrary or ambiguous and cannot be a distinction relied upon to make life-altering, inheritable decisions. Now, while this uncertainty is often true and can become a serious concern, there are a set of boundaries that we may employ to refute this ambiguity. The framework that I propose is to consider whether the suffering caused by illness is either intrinsic or socially constructed. As observed in a study in 2001, illness and suffering arise from both biological and social sources. This implies that not all alleged suffering originates from medical diseases. Accordingly, let us consider a middle schooler's kryptonite, acne, which is an inflammatory disorder that is often socially mediated. Contrary to HD, acne does not pose a serious medical threat and remains a largely aesthetic condition. Therefore, any genetic intervention intended to prevent this condition would be considered an enhancing genetic therapy. Not because the condition causes no distress whatsoever, but because the distress it generates is predominantly rooted in social perception rather than biological necessity. Simply, the suffering caused by conditions like acne are contingent upon certain circumstances, environment, and social expectations. Without certain pressures and expectations, the alleged medical urgency drops, and acne remains a harmless condition that is occasionally a nuisance. This scenario paints the exact framework that I am presenting. Admittedly, every general principle will have its exceptions, and no framework can adequately address every case with mathematical precision. However, moral judgment rarely operates with such clarity, but is rather driven by principled discernment. This framework is to be used as a basis for future judgment, complemented by careful, rational, and meticulous moral judgment. A more morally provocative argument considers the question of whether we are to edit or engineer specific aspects of a human being that are fundamental to their identities. In the book, The Case Against Perfection by Michael J. Sandel, he emphasizes that to appreciate gifts, children as gifts, is to accept them as they come, not as objects of our own design or products of our will or instruments of our ambition. Sandel's position represents what many call the ethics of giftedness, the idea that unconditional acceptance of a child is not weakness or resignation, but a moral virtue in itself. Take the genetic disorder of Down syndrome, caused by the presence of a third copy of trisomy 21. Down syndrome is the most common chromosomal condition, with every 1 to 700 babies born with Down syndrome, and approximately 600,000 people alone in the US with this condition. A more startling statistic is that 74% of parents, when told of a diagnosis for Down syndrome, choose to exterminate the child. Many of you know that I have a brother with Down syndrome, and if you have met him, you would quickly see that he is one of the happiest individuals you could ever encounter. However, as I continue to research and wrestle with genetic engineering's implications, I came across the striking question of whether I would want to edit my brother or not. To edit him would be to treat his identity as a flaw to be corrected, which is precisely the mindset Sandel warns against. From deafness, Down syndrome, and even blindness, these biological challenges often transform an individual's lives and create meaningful identities that impact many people in many different ways. So then this raises the question, should we utilize genetic engineering to fix these alleged genetic disorders? Sandel's concerns are valid in many respects, yet this objection assumes that a genetic condition identifies a person rather than something the person bears. This is also called genetic essentialism. Here lies the crucial distinction. Down syndrome is caused by trisomy 21. It is a biological condition that often brings increased risk of congenital heart defects, early onset Alzheimer's disease, immune dysfunction, leukemia, and shortened life expectancy. Furthermore, the joy and love my brother displays are not products of an extra chromosome, but they are products of his soul, his family, his relationships, and the joy given to him by God. To refuse germline interventions out of fear of changing his identity conflates personhood with pathology. Regardless of any person's genetics, every individual is made in the image of God and possesses inherent dignity. Therefore, editing a disease in the embryo does not declare that these individuals are less valuable, but instead affirms that their suffering matters. It acknowledges the sanctity of life by making efforts to take responsibility for the weak's vulnerabilities. This distinction becomes clear when posed as two separate questions. To edit a person as they exist now would be to treat their identity as a flaw to be corrected, which no act of compassion demands. But to prevent the medical complications, cognitive barriers, and many other trials that accompany Down syndrome in a future child is a different matter. Simply put, choosing to alleviate suffering is not an act of rejection or demeaning, but is an act of compassion and sanctity. Throughout my thesis, I have proved that enhancing genetic interventions degrade human flourishing, whereas therapeutic genetic treatments foster human flourishing. First, this thesis has established a framework for human flourishing using classical perspectives. This definition was tested on enhancing genetic interventions, where it became clear that such treatments are detrimental to human flourishing and must be rejected. In a similar manner, therapeutic genetic treatments were considered and affirmed as treatments that foster human flourishing, which should be continued to be researched and embraced. I've considered two main refutations: the ambiguity between therapeutic and enhancement treatments, and the problem of identity editing. In sum, therapeutic treatments maintain a nuance that prevents them from being simply eradicating agents, but instead a means to preserve life's sanctity and value in every single individual. During my interview with the assistant professor for biomedical engineering at Duke University, Dr. Cameron Kim noted his pessimism on the issue, expressing that, quote, he sadly wished he had a more optimistic view, but considering many of the current discussion points out there, it's hard to see this getting resolved in the next 20 years. While this perspective may be warranted, I believe that mere pessimism is a failure of a response as Christians and stewards of the gifts God has given us. The complexities of germline genetic engineering do not absolve us of responsibility. Rather, it requires more effort for wise decisions, clear moral reasoning, and hopeful engagement with the issue. Humans are made in the image of God. As such, our scientific capacities are not accidents, but entrusted abilities that must be governed by reason and virtue. As with many other interventions, such as AI or the nuclear bomb, the question is not whether genetic power will exist, but whether it will be directed toward human flourishing or distorted by appetite and pride. Therefore, the task before us is not withdrawal, nor blind optimism, but an active moral stewardship. Therapeutic interventions that restore or preserve flourishing ought to be pursued with humility and caution. Enhancements that prioritize appetites over reason and circumvent virtue must be resisted. We must not idolize or fear our technology. Instead, we must subject it to higher standards of virtue, prudence, and reason. Only then can scientific progress serve rather than degrade the flourishing of a human being. In mythology, Prometheus was known as the thief of fire. But now we have a choice, whether to be mere thieves of the genetic code or to be firekeepers, ensuring that the light given to us by God shines brightly without burning what we truly value. Thank you.
Isaac, outstanding job. Isaac's given us a lot to think about. He's chosen a complex topic, and so if you all have questions for him, this is a great time to ask them. How this is going to go, if you have a question for Isaac, just raise your hand. I'll give you the mic, and then I would ask that you just speak into it like this so that we can catch it in the live stream. But without further ado, let's get going.
Andrew.
Really great job, Isaac. You were very well spoken. So I had a question before you went into your conclusion. So you brought up your brother as an example, that we shouldn't change him because he is made in the image of God and has been shaped. And that would be denying him as basically forming him as a flaw. Right. And I completely agree. But then you also bring up that we should change embryos in the womb. Mm-hmm. And yet in a Christian standpoint, we are shown that they are made in the image of God as well. Mm-hmm. And we are being knit together in our mother's wombs. So it seems like a kind of a contradiction to say, right, you can edit them here but not here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so number one, I think I'm not claiming that those two acts are equivalent by any means. Second, I think that when you edit a embryo for, let's say, Down syndrome, it's sort of analogous to corrective heart surgery, where the difference isn't in the dignity between the embryo and the human, like my brother, but it's the fact that you're preventing suffering in the future. They're not equivalent acts by any means, but the difference isn't between the dignity. It's between the cause of the treatment.
So, do you think editing your brother now, which sounds horrible, I wouldn't say that you should do that, but do you think it would be able to help prevent further suffering in the future to kind of reshape how his life is now?
Yeah, I think that it's really tricky because simply, I think if I was in a position to edit, I would say no, we can't overstep the boundaries and the sanctity that God provides in life. But also, yes, because if we have the possibility to prevent suffering, then we should. We have a call to preserve life and life sanctity. So it's really tricky. It's ethically nuanced and also theologically nuanced. And so, but as of right now, I want you to know that that is largely impossible. It's a polygenic trait, and so being able to edit such a big condition like Down syndrome is practically impossible. Maybe in the near future, but I can't give you a clear, precise answer for that. Maria.
So good, Isaac. Are you like hoping to go into this field in college, and if so, like how would you want to influence it?
Yeah, I think it's a really growing field. It's definitely a frontier right now, and I'm planning on studying genetics in college, and we'll see where that goes. Maybe CRISPR, maybe medicine. But I think even now, it's even more pertinent for people with backgrounds in ethics or philosophy to be involved in the study of genetics or medicine. We need ethical leaders in the future that will regulate genetic engineering or AI or nuclear bombs. And so we're in an age where technology is really a weapon, but it's also a tool. And so we need people who are versed in both areas. Sorry.
Great job, Isaac. And you know I'm going to love a Frankenstein reference at the beginning of this thesis. But like Frankenstein, where he made a lot of decisions that he didn't take responsibilities for, do you not just think that any pursuit of this is going, I mean, you can say we need ethics, you can say we need all these things. Don't you think eventually it will become what we don't want it to become, that just letting it loose will be bad?
Right. I think the genetic technology is already here. And so if we take that mindset of, if we take further action and kind of influence it, it might end up badly. We have to proactively prevent these genetic technologies from progressing in the future. Just because it exists, we can't be like, hands off, I'm not gonna touch it until it's like really necessary. We have to be preventative, not corrective, if that makes sense. Tanner?
Great job. At the beginning of your thesis, you talk a lot about classical kind of philosophy and stuff, and a lot about Aristotle and Plato's virtues. But as Christians, like, how can we kind of reconcile this from a Christian perspective rather than purely a classical perspective?
Yeah, that's a good question. I was looking into that a lot for my thesis. I was talking with Mr. Clark as well about that question, how we are to reconcile those things. And I think the biggest thing that we came up with was that a lot of these frameworks, whether Plato and Aristotle, they directly line up with Christian frameworks. For example, Summa Theologica by Augustine. Many of the frameworks that Aristotle proposed, life of virtue, not circumventing it, is directly in correlation with Summa Theologica, just with a Christian perspective. Dr. Vandenberg.
Where are we going?
Dr. Vandenberg.
So can you clarify a little bit the difference between when it's okay and when it's not okay to use CRISPR to change somebody's genetic makeup?
Yeah, and so the distinction that I proposed was considering whether the suffering that is caused by the genetic condition is intrinsic or socially constructed. I use acne as an example because acne is not medically urgent. It's just a condition that aesthetically it's not the best. Whereas HD is a medically urgent condition, and so you need to go to the hospital when you get that. And so to prevent those treatments, to prevent those diseases, you would probably engineer HD over acne, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Because acne is a largely enhancing, it's an aesthetic condition.
Sure. So, and then you also made the distinction between using CRISPR on a person who's already kind of been
Right.
alive for a while and using it on an embryo in the womb, right?
Mhm.
If you could, so what if you had somebody with HD, okay, who is 15, and you know somebody that the embryo is going to have HD? Is it okay to use CRISPR on the 15-year-old to save their life, or would you say no?
Well, also first, I just want to, like, we are talking about the future, but right now it's impossible to edit HD out. But if that were to happen, I think it's largely unethical to edit the 15-year-old with HD, because he's already formed an identity that has been created by HD. But also we have to be careful not to fall into a self-flagellate mindset where your suffering causes your identity. What you want to do is, I think it's really hard, 15-year-old or embryo, but I think 15-year-old is largely unethical.
Really? Like,
Yeah.
So what about, did you look at HAE at all? Like, is Victoria in here? No. Victoria Thigpen has HAE, right? And there's a possibility that it can be cured with genetic changes,
Yeah.
genetic engineering, so that somebody like her wouldn't have to suffer, but they could just live a normal life
Right.
with that intervention. So you think that intervention to give that person kind of a normal life is not ethical?
I don't want this to sound like a cop-out, but when I was talking about in my thesis is specifically germline. Somatic treatments are really complex because you have a lot more cells in your body than in the embryo, and so it's really hard to edit like say HD. It's really hard to edit that out, and so I don't really have an answer for you ethically because I was more concerned with germline therapies.
Okay.
Peter.
Great job, Isaac. At the beginning of your thesis, you sort of brought up how babies are screened for Down syndrome early on, and parents then can see if their kid might have Down syndrome or not. Do you think that we should not screen for Down syndrome knowing that a certain percentage of parents are going to abort their children?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think screening, should still happen, even with. I think the fact that they choose to exterminate their child 74% of the times shouldn't mean that we should stop screening. We should provide more counseling for the parents in order to be more well-informed for their decision rather than preventing screening, because that is a legitimately helpful tool that people use in medicine. We'll go with Michael.
Great job, Isaac. In society, we have a lot of different views on ethics and morals and the way that things we should and shouldn't do. What are steps that you think you would recommend that we can take in order to make sure that the proper ethical framework is being preserved, particularly in the route of genetic engineering?
Yeah, I think it's important to keep these perspectives in mind, the frameworks of Plato and Aristotle, but it's also important for the parents to teach their children about these frameworks, because nowadays, like people say Plato and Aristotle, they're irrelevant, but they're really not. The foundation of Western civilization is Jerusalem and Athens. It's a combination of these frameworks, and so as members of Western society, we should keep these in mind, and we should think about these things before they actually get to a point where it's urgent and we can't do anything about it. Mr. Clark.
So let's just take for granted that at some undetermined point in the future, you can go willy-nilly and play with your genes and make them do whatever you want. How much do you think our genes determine who we are?
So not a lot. There's a problem called the fallacy of genetic determinism, which I had to omit because of length. But it's the fallacy that you think your genetics will determine everything about you in the future. No yeah, no tolerance for your human interactions, your personality, how you grow up as a person, but your genetics determine all of that. And so your genetics really don't determine a lot of you. It only determines specific traits of your body. Mr. Cow.
Isaac, just to get some clarification on the application of some of these treatments, you mentioned a lot of the somatic treatments,
Yeah.
especially for aesthetic purposes, you wouldn't be in favor of. Let's take the high schooler with acne, for example. Let's remove the germline or somatic part of it, like for something like Accutane. Would you
Yeah.
be against a high schooler seeking treatment for that in particular? Or is that something that instead should be bared and kind of worked through?
Yeah, I think genetic germline treatments are more corrective. No, they're preventative more than corrective. Acne, if it already exists, then treating it is a therapeutic application. But if you're from the embryo, if you genetically engineer the baby to have perfect skin, it's preventative. And so that's the kind of distinction there. It's you're preventing a disease from happening versus you're correcting from it. Ms. Hamilton.
Great job, Isaac. You touched on this a little bit with your answer to Mr. Clark's question. Was there anything else that you weren't able to include in what we heard today, or something that really surprised you as you went through your research on this very technical and personal topic?
Well, I think it was pretty shocking to see how much people weren't really thinking about ethics when talking about genetic engineering. They're just like, we won't really touch on it because it's a topic that's not going to get resolved. That was the wide consensus that I came across in my research. But I thought it was really shocking to see no one really touched it. All they said when like ethical frameworks, they just used the intrinsic moral code instead of Plato or Aristotle that articulated better. Other things that I had to admit were political regulations. I mentioned that earlier, but there's certain organizations like UNESCO or WHO that actually do actively regulate genetic engineering. But it would have been fascinating to go into that in more depth, but I couldn't, yeah. Marcus.
In the future, when these CRISPR treatments are available, would they, do you have any sort of idea how much they would cost and if they would even be a feasible option for many families?
There are genetic treatments that already exist, and they do cost a lot. And that raises concerns of whether the wealthy might be able to gain access to these treatments and lower class might not be able to, and so it causes a social disparity. But I think the way that we prevent against that is if we ban enhancement-driven modifications and disable the wealthy from gaining access to those enhancing therapies, that kind of offsets the disparity that you have there. Because the wealthy aren't gaining access to these enhancing features, whether you're enhancing your athletics or your intelligence. And so the social kind of the lower class kind of falls behind. Ms. Kyle.
Excellent job, Isaac. Thank you for sharing all you learned. So my question has sort of been asked, but maybe not exactly the same. You commented in your thesis about science being a gift from God, and I totally agree with that. Knowledge is a gift. My question is, where is the line between God's sovereignty in creating an embryo and God's sovereignty in us using the science?
I think that's a really tricky question. I think it's important for us to remember what the purpose of the therapy is. If the purpose of the therapy is to enhance, then that's overseeing the boundaries that God has given us for his sanctity in life. But if we're using it to prevent suffering in the future, then I think it's somewhat acceptable. But that varies on a case-by-case basis. What I'm saying is it's not to serve as a mathematical, precise evaluation, but it should be taken on a case-by-case basis. Ransom.
So you talked several times in questions about when you would think germline versus somatic therapies are acceptable. So why is there a difference between preventing a kid from having acne and correcting a kid's acne?
Like, what is the ethical difference there? Because you talked about pathology versus personhood. And so if we're just removing the pathology,
Right.
the acne from the kid, we're not changing their personality or anything, why is that an issue versus
Yeah.
germline treatment?
I think the biggest issue there is when you're editing an embryo for a specific trait, you're the one in control. When you get to therapeutic treatments, when it's corrective, you're not the one in control. You're restoring the conditions necessary for flourishing. In the embryo, you're preventing it, and so it's all in your hands. You can edit your baby however you want, create designer baby. So does that distinction kind of make sense, like the difference?
No. Like, you kept saying you're in control. What do you mean by that? Like, who's me? Like,
Well, you can tell the scientists, like, you determine which traits you want to engineer and how you want to engineer it.
right. So, okay, can you re-explain the difference then? Like, reword the difference? Because why are you in more control with somatic versus germline?
Because you're actively, like, okay, say I had a baby, right? Like, I'm editing it, right? And I can edit it to become super athletic or super smart, right? I'm the one making those decisions. Whereas corrective is the disease has already developed, and all you're doing is you're removing that disease and you're correcting for it. Does that make a bit more sense? Okay. We can talk after. This last.
Isaac, great job. And you know my heart when I ask this question because I have a daughter with Down syndrome and who is also deaf. And so it's interesting to think about a therapeutic intervention because I think had I been given an opportunity at the beginning prenatally, I might have chosen, well, maybe keep the Down syndrome but take away the deafness. How do you reconcile just the cultural piece with the therapeutic intervention, and then build on that is, do you hope that in your education, your cohort and classmates studying this also almost are required to take philosophy and classical Christian classes?
Yeah, I think it's really important for those classes to exist. Supplementing your education in biology with philosophy. I think also, sorry, I lost my train of thought, but I think what you say is it's really important because it was hard for me as well thinking about it because my brother is who he is now, and I don't think I would have engineered him out as of now. If I had the choice back then, that's a trickier question, and it was really hard for me to come up with an answer for that. I'm still discovering it as well, and I think it's very ethically nuanced, and so I can't give you a direct answer for that right now. Yeah. Dr. Cal.
Excellent job, Isaac. So as a Jesus follower, and thinking about entering into this field where, maybe Christians aren't always invited into this space, is using a Platonic and an Aristotelian framework kind of a strategic move? Because I know you're functioning out of a Christian worldview anyway, in terms of how you would just kind of enter the conversation, or is there another approach? Does that make sense?
Yeah. The reason why I use Plato and Aristotle is we all have a intrinsic moral code, and I think Plato and Aristotle did the best at articulating that. And so, I don't think people say these frameworks are largely outdated, they're irrelevant, but I think they're still very relevant, and they articulate our moral code in a really good way. And so, in terms of strategy, I don't know what other strategy I would use. I think this is a great basis. You obviously have to think about it and apply Christian perspectives as well, but this should serve as a good base strategy for tackling genetic engineering.
I'm going to go back maybe to Ransom's question a little bit and try it again. So if you have, so what's the difference if you have, say, a mortal illness that is genetic, I won't pick one, but a mortal illness that's genetic, that you've lived with for a number of years, and the opportunity becomes available to, through some kind of nanotechnology, to be able to use CRISPR throughout your body and change so that you have your cells can become normal and you can live a normal life. Why you're saying that would be unethical, right?
I think so. Yeah.
Okay. What's the basis? What's the pivot for that to be unethical as a treatment for someone who's older versus a treatment for an embryo that has not been out of the womb yet? What's the pivot for that?
Could you rephrase your question just quick?
Okay, so if you have a mortal illness that is genetic and you've lived with that for a number of years, but the technology becomes available to fix it, my sense is that you're saying you think it's unethical to fix it if you've lived with it for a while, but in an embryo, it would be ethical to prevent the suffering caused by that genetic problem.
Well, I think if it's a medically urgent condition and it's existed for a while, like you said, and it's mortal, then I think genetic treatments don't have the ability to treat that immediately and be able to have actual rapid effect. I think it could be possible, but I think it is ethical to edit it if it is mortal, not if it's not mortal and it's not as medically urgent as the other conditions that I talked about. Does that make sense?
Okay, yeah, that's kind of, so that's why okay, we can talk later.
Fortunately, that is all the time we have. If you want to ask guys questions, ask them. Great job.